Emptiness is not nothingness. It's how everything exists. Buddhist wisdom. For centuries, Buddhism has been misread, in the West and even in parts of Asia, as a religion of negation. The world is an illusion. Nothing is real. The goal is to dissolve into nothingness. This misunderstanding is not accidental. It is rooted, in large part, in one word, a word that almost everyone has heard and almost no one truly understands. Emptiness. Sunyata. But if emptiness really meant nothingness, why would the Buddha call it one of the gates that leads directly to the end of all suffering? Today, I want to walk with you through 3 levels. 3 ways this word has been understood across 25 centuries, so that by the end, you might begin to see emptiness the way the Buddha intended. A common assumption today is that emptiness belongs to the later traditions, to the Mahayana, to the Madhyamaka philosophers. Many people believe the historical Buddha never spoke about it. This assumption is wrong. The Buddha spoke about emptiness directly, repeatedly, and with remarkable clarity. There is a moment recorded in the Sunyata Sutta that captures the essence of what the Buddha meant. Venerable Ananda came to him and asked, "It is said that the world is empty. In what sense is it said that the world is empty?" The Buddha's answer was precise. Insofar as it is empty of a self or of anything pertaining to a self, Ananda, it is said that the world is empty. And then he walked Ananda through the entire field of experience, one element at a time. The eye is empty of a self. Visible forms are empty of a self. Eye consciousness, eye contact, empty of a self. And whatever feeling arises dependent on that contact, pleasant, painful, or neutral, that too is empty of a self. The ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, the mind, each one, along with its objects, its consciousness, its contact, and whatever feeling arises from that contact, all empty of a self or of anything pertaining to a self. He was not saying the world does not exist. The eye still sees. The ear still hears. Consciousness functions. But within every moment of seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, there is no owner. No fixed entity at the center. The processes are there. But the person you imagine yourself to be, the one who has these experiences, that one cannot be found anywhere in the field of experience. And the world here is not the external universe. It is the world of the 6 senses, their objects, the contact between them, and whatever arises from that contact. The world as lived experience. This insight grew directly from Paticcasamuppada, dependent origination. The Buddha laid out 12 links. Because of ignorance, volitional formations arise. Formations condition consciousness. Consciousness conditions name and form, which conditions the 6 sense bases. Contact, feeling. Feeling conditions craving. Craving conditions clinging. Clinging conditions becoming. Becoming conditions birth. And birth conditions aging. Death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. The entire mass of suffering. And when ignorance ceases, formations cease. Consciousness ceases. All the way through, and the entire mass of suffering ceases. This sequence is often presented as a description of how reality works. But the Buddha was answering one question. Why do we suffer? And how does that suffering end? The 12 links are a diagnosis and a cure. And within that entire chain, there is no sufferer. Only processes leaning on each other, each one arising because the previous one is present. The suffering is real. The one who suffers is not. The Buddha also taught how to enter emptiness as a lived experience. In the Kula Sunyata Sutta, he gave Ananda a step-by-step method for dwelling in emptiness, moving through progressively subtler layers of perception: village, people, wilderness, earth, the formless dimensions, until the mind rests in the signless immersion of the heart. At each stage, the instruction is the same. Whatever is not present here, he regards as empty of that. Whatever remains here, he knows. This is present. And at each stage, the emptiness manifests genuine, undistorted, and pure. Emptiness here is not a metaphysical property. It is a relative, experiential state. Something is empty of something. Layer by layer, the meditator strips away what is not essential, seeing clearly at each level what is absent and what remains. And at the final stage, the meditator understands. Even this signless immersion of the heart is produced by choices and intentions. And whatever is produced by choices and intentions is impermanent and liable to cessation. Knowing and seeing this, the mind is freed. And the texts add one word to describe this final emptiness that they do not add to any of the previous stages: supreme. Something else is present in the early discourses, something that contains an enormous implication the Buddha chose not to unfold. In the Pakaya Sutta, the Buddha said, "Whether there is an arising of Tathagatas or no arising of Tathagatas, that element still persists. The stableness of the Dhamma, the fixed course of the Dhamma, specific conditionality, idapakayata. A Tathagata awakens to this and breaks through to it." His choice of language deserves attention. He called conditionality a dhatu, an element, something belonging to the nature of reality itself. He called it dhammatitata, the stableness of the Dhamma, and dhammaniyamata, the fixed course, the regularity of the Dhamma. These describe something embedded in the way things are, persisting whether or not anyone recognizes it. He did not create this principle. He awakened to it. But immediately after this statement, the Buddha went straight back into the 12 links. With birth as condition, aging and death comes to be. He took this universal-sounding principle and applied it to the specific question of how suffering arises and how it ends. He never sat his monks down and said, "And this is also how mountains form and rivers flow." He always brought it back to liberation. There is a second seed. In the Kakanagota Sutta, the Buddha told Venerable Kakanagota that the world, for the most part, depends on a duality, the notion of existence and the notion of non-existence. But for one who sees the origin of the world as it really is, with correct wisdom, there is no notion of non-existence. And for one who sees the cessation of the world as it really is, there is no notion of existence. Avoiding both extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma by the middle, through dependent origination. Here the Buddha is defining the middle way as the refusal to land on either things truly exist or things do not exist at all. When you see arising, you cannot say nothing is there. When you see cessation, you cannot say something permanent is there. And the bridge between those two cliffs is dependent origination, the direct seeing that things arise through conditions and cease when those conditions change. The Buddha did not use the word emptiness in this discourse. He did not extend this insight to all phenomena. But both seeds, a persisting principle of conditionality, a middle way born from direct seeing rather than doctrinal commitment, sit clearly in the early canon. Why did the Buddha not take the next step? There is a moment that may help us understand. Once, while staying at Kosambi in a Simsapa forest, the Buddha picked up a few Simsapa leaves with his hand and asked the monks, What do you think? Which are more numerous, the few leaves in my hand or those overhead in the forest?" They answered, "The leaves in your hand are few, Lord. Those overhead in the forest are far more numerous." And the Buddha said, "In the same way, those things that I have known with direct knowledge but have not taught are far more numerous than what I have taught. And why haven't I taught them? Because they are not connected with the goal, do not relate to the rudiments of the holy life, and do not lead to disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, calm, direct knowledge, self-awakening, and nibbana." And then he said something very specific. "And what have I taught? This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. That is what I have taught." His criterion for teaching was not what is true about the universe. It was the Four Noble Truths, and everything that serves them. The seeds remained in the soil, visible to anyone who looked carefully enough. 600 years passed, and during those centuries, the Buddhist philosophical landscape shifted considerably. Various schools of Abhidharma had emerged, each attempting to map the ultimate constituents of reality. One influential position, particularly within the Sarvastivada school, held that while the person is indeed empty of self, the dharmas themselves, the basic elements of experience, possess svabhava, their own inherent nature. Fire has the inherent nature of heat. Earth has the inherent nature of solidity. The aggregates are real at the ultimate level. Only the self, constructed from them, is not. This was a rigorous position, and in a way, a natural development of the Buddha's own analytical method. But it introduced something the Buddha had been careful to avoid: the notion that at some level of analysis, you arrive at things that exist in their own right, things that are no longer conditioned, no longer dependent, but simply and inherently there. And this sits uneasily beside the principle of idappaccayata. If something truly has its own inherent nature, in what sense is it dependently arisen? This is the tension Nāgārjuna addressed. In the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, the fundamental verses of the Middle Way, he took the Buddha's seeds and grew them to their full height. His core logic was straightforward. The Buddha declared conditionality a dhatu, a persisting principle of reality. If everything that exists arises through conditions, then nothing can possess svabhava, because having an inherent nature means existing independently, without depending on anything else. Something that depends on conditions, by definition, does not exist from its own side. Therefore, all phenomena, not just the person, but the dharmas themselves, are empty of inherent existence. Everything the Abhidharma schools had treated as ultimately real arises through conditions, and therefore everything is shunya, empty. He expressed this in verse 24.18. Whatever is dependently arisen, that we declare to be emptiness, that is a dependent designation, and that itself is the middle way. He took three concepts that existed separately in the early teachings: dependent origination, emptiness, the middle way, and revealed them as three names for the same insight. To say things arise through conditions is to say things are empty of inherent existence. And to say things are empty of inherent existence is to walk the middle between things absolutely exist and things do not exist at all, exactly where the Buddha placed the middle way in the Kaccanagotta Sutta. Nāgārjuna did not invent a new teaching. He uncovered a unity already present in the Buddha's words, one that 6 centuries of philosophical development had partially obscured. In a sense, he was returning to something the Buddha had already seen, but had expressed in a different way, for a different purpose. And his contribution went deeper still. Emptiness does not undermine the reality of the world, it explains it. Things can function, can arise and cease, can cause effects, precisely because they are empty of fixed inherent nature. If things truly had svabhava, if they existed from their own side, unchangingly, they could never arise, never change, never interact. A fire with an absolutely fixed nature of heat could never come into being through the rubbing of sticks, because its existence would not depend on conditions. It is the very emptiness of things that allows them to participate in the flowing web of cause and effect that we call the living world. Far from negating the world, emptiness is what makes the world work. This is what Nāgārjuna meant when he wrote, "For whom emptiness is possible, everything is possible. For whom emptiness is not possible, nothing is possible." But he also understood that this insight carries its own danger. In verse 13.8, the Buddhas have taught emptiness as the relinquishing of all views. But those who hold emptiness as a view, they are the incurable ones. Emptiness was taught as medicine, a way to release every rigid position about how things truly are. If you turn that medicine into another rigid position, you have used a teaching about letting go to create something new to hold on to. When we say emptiness is how everything exists, we are speaking at this level. Everything exists. The table is there. The rain falls. Your body breathes. But the way everything exists is through conditions. Dependent, interconnected, without any fixed core. And the purpose of seeing this remains what it was in the Buddha's time, to cling less, and through that, to suffer less. You have now traveled through 25 centuries of thought. And if you are honest with yourself, there is a question forming, the most important question of all. Does any of this actually matter on the path of practice? Is understanding emptiness genuinely necessary for someone walking the Buddha's path toward awakening? The question matters because the Buddha himself was fiercely practical. He compared his teaching to a raft, useful for crossing the river, but not something to carry on your head once you have reached the other shore. If emptiness did not serve the purpose of liberation, he would not have taught it. But he did teach it. He called dwelling in emptiness his own regular practice. He described the progressive deepening of emptiness meditation as culminating in the supreme emptiness, the one that leads to the complete ending of defilements. And he placed it as one of the three vimokkha, the three gates that lead directly to liberation. These three gates deserve attention. The emptiness liberation is freedom through the direct insight into non-self. The signless liberation is freedom through seeing that all formations are impermanent. The wishless liberation is freedom through seeing that all conditioned things are marked by unsatisfactoriness, so that craving toward any of them naturally falls away. Three gates, one nibbana. Each one is real, and each one opens onto the same freedom. And these three gates are more intertwined than they appear. When you see impermanence deeply enough, watching a sensation arise and dissolve, then another, you are also seeing that there is no fixed entity behind those changes. The seeing of impermanence, taken deep enough, becomes the seeing of non-self. And the seeing of non-self reveals that clinging itself is the root of pain. So even if you have never heard the word sunyata, if you are simply watching your breath, watching thoughts appear and dissolve, you are already touching what emptiness points to. The name does not matter. The seeing does. That is the value of emptiness on the spiritual path. It is woven into the very fabric of insight practice, whether or not you recognize it by name. But what about ordinary life? Think about what happens when you lose something that matters. A relationship ends. Someone you love dies. The pain is real. But much of our suffering is not in the loss itself. It is in the conviction that the loss should not have happened, that something permanent has been taken from us. When you see that everything you have ever loved existed through conditions, always in motion, always dependent on countless threads, then loss lands differently. You still grieve, but there is less of the desperate why, and more of a quiet recognition that this is how things have always moved. And when you see that the person who hurt you is also shaped by conditions they did not choose, driven by fears and wounds that stretch far beyond them, something softens. You are seeing them more clearly, and that clarity, over time, becomes compassion. But let me bring this even closer. The Buddha, sitting on the bank of the Ganges, once offered his monks 5 images, one for each of the 5 aggregates. This is recorded in the Fina Sutta, and it is perhaps the most vivid teaching on emptiness in the entire canon. Form, this body, is like a lump of foam on the river. You can see it, you can touch it. Examine it closely, and there is nothing solid inside. Feeling is like a water bubble formed by autumn rain. It appears on the surface and pops right away. Perception is like a shimmering mirage on a hot road. From a distance it looks real. Walk toward it, and there is nothing there. Volitional formations are like a banana trunk. It looks solid. Peel away layer after layer, and there is no heartwood, no core. Consciousness is like a magic trick at a crossroads, vivid, immediate, conjured by conditions, with no substance behind it. Each of these is perfectly real as what it is. A lump of foam is a real lump of foam. It is just not a solid mass. A water bubble really appears. It simply does not last. The aggregates exist as impermanent conditioned phenomena. They appear as something other than they are. And this is exactly where our suffering lives. In the gap between what things are and what we take them to be. We treat foam as stone. We treat bubbles as permanent. We treat mirages as water. And when reality refuses to cooperate with our assumptions, we call that suffering. The Buddha said, "Seeing thus, a learned noble disciple grows disillusioned with form, with feeling, with perception, with formations, with consciousness. Being disillusioned, desire fades away. When desire fades away, they are freed." He did not say, "Force yourself to let go." He said, "See clearly that foam is foam, that a bubble is a bubble, that a mirage is a mirage, and disenchantment arises on its own. Through disenchantment, dispassion. Through dispassion, freedom. Letting go happens as a natural consequence of seeing clearly. You cannot cling to something once you have seen through it, any more than you can fear a rope once you have clearly seen it is not a snake. And that is the most honest thing that can be said about emptiness and its place on the path. It is a way of seeing, a way of looking at your own body, your own feelings, your own mind, and recognizing that what you have been treating as solid is foam. What you have been treating as lasting is a bubble. What you have been treating as real is a mirage. And when you see this clearly enough, the grip loosens, by itself, without force. That is emptiness. The Buddha saw it in the 12 links of suffering. Nāgārjuna saw it in the fabric of all phenomena. And you can see it right now, in the rise and fall of your own breath. In that seeing, nothing is lost, because nothing was ever held.